I'm just going to be discussing the document property editor that Joe mentioned is a very important part of our point release and what it does now and what we hope to do in the future. So the why as to why we created the DPE is we already had a tool called the reflected property editor that would take compile time, as in code time, data, reflection data about classes like C++ classes and their attributes, and read that and then put that into an editor for users to be able to change properties. Like you'll see in the RPE diagram here, you can change the XYZ of the positioning or the rotation of the particular entity, things like that. The problem with that is that's all compile time data. So if you wanted to have something that was dynamic, that was to how the user was creating content at the time, we couldn't really support that with the RPE without some real wrestling and kind of making it into what it didn't want to be. So we designed the document property editor as a replacement for the RPE. As you can see at the bottom, it looks very similar to the DPE or to the RPE by design, and it was designed as a drop-in replacement. So the RPE is already used in tools like the Entity Inspector, which you're seeing there, the Asset Editor, and the Material Editor. But the RPE could not handle dynamic data, and prefab overrides, a new concept of being able to change properties on like kind of a derived prefab from an existing one. That's dynamic content, and we couldn't do that without a recompile, which was a terrible workflow for the user. So we decided to make uh, a new editor, the DPE, that would separate out the document and the actual widgets, the kind of view, and that could be those documents could be generated and read dynamically. So even though reflection data was determined at compile time and that was good enough for the RPE, prefab overrides happen dynamically, often during runtime, so we needed a new tool for that. How does this work? So the DPE is all about generating and parsing documents. So there's a separation of the kind of model and views, how we talk about it in Qt land, but also just general model view controller architecture. So we have the document, which is an XML-like document. It's actually JSON, but we can visualize it in XML-like terms. So if you look at the bottom left image there, you can see that's actually the XML-ish document that would generate the widget on the right. That's the transform component of a given entity. So you can see it's quite a bit of data, but it's a lot simpler when it's in JSON. So the adapter, you have a C++ class that's an adapter, and that can generate the document, and that describes all the rows and columns and sub widgets and the hierarchy of your UI. And the DPE, the document property editor, does the actual layout and rendering. That's what generates the image on the right. This has a lot of benefits, as the dynamic documents, as I described earlier, is a big one, but it can also allows documents to be easily tested and verified without having a view on them. It's notoriously difficult to test just graphical applications, whereas here we can do so much more of the testing just within the document, like the code space itself, without having to rely on how it's rendered. And this will even allow for in the future, which we'll talk about a bit later, the adapter and the editor could actually live in different modules or even different machines, which would allow a remote viewing of dynamic content. Unlike the RPE, which was always just a label on the left and a widget on the right, this allows us to have the DPE has a lot more flexibility for columns and layouts. So it's a full hierarchy of rows with column widgets, and each row can specify its column count, and rows can contain an arbitrary mix of sub rows, so child rows, labels, and widgets. You'll see in this test application that's part of the DPE standalone app, which is in the O3DE code base. The config you can generate, and you can set these up. You can set the row count and the column count. That control itself has only 4 columns, and then you can have an arbitrary number of rows and columns there. So you could make something like a matrix editor easily in the DPE without having to try to specify just one row and column count for the entire application. It can be absolutely mixed and matched within the same view. And we don't like reinventing the wheel if we don't have to. So we also made a lot of common tools that DPE-based applications can use. So for instance, there's an existing sort adapter that allows a programmer to specify just the way that their documents should be, the rows in their document should be considered for sorting, which basically offloads all the complexity of writing sorting yourself and just allows you to specify this row is greater, this is less, and this is how you do it, like a simple sort function. And similar for the filter adapter, which allows for searching filtering. So you can just type in a string or whatever, and then depending on how you design your tool, that can search in metadata or search in visible fields to choose what rows and what column widgets are displayed. You'll see at the bottom here, these are two different tools. The one on the left is the console variable editor, which is actually the first editor in the O3DE code base to use the DPE, and that's been out for a while. And then on the right hand is the new DPE-based inspector, which looks suspiciously like the old RPE-based inspector. But you'll see they both have scale typed into their search field, and they're both using the same kind of sort adapter, except the one on the left, the console variable window, specifies that it searches the text of the label on the left as well as its metadata or its description data. So you'll see that second field. So the first field has the word scale in it, that makes sense, but then it says ed icon close dist. Like, why is that in my scale search? But you'll see I moused over it in the screen shot, and it says distance at which icons are at maximum scale. So the reason that's included is because it's descriptive text includes the word scale. So that's just how I chose to design that tool, but that's up to the designer of the tool for what they include in the filter information. And then the last kind of common but very useful adapter that is chainable with the rest of these is the aggregate adapter. And that's used for multi-editing common properties. We use this for if you select multiple entities in the view or in the outliner, and then in the inspector will show you the properties that it has, that those two entities have in common, not just the components, but also the sub-properties of them. So it's designed to look for any commonly named properties and only allow them in if they both match. But this allows for kind of very complex editing where you could select 20 different items in whatever kind of tool DPE-based tool you are using, and then you could change all their properties in the same manner. So let's say you wanted them all to be turned off and there's a visibility field. You could just select them all, multi-edit them with the aggregate adapter, and then uncheck visible, and then they all would lose their visibility flag instead of you having to tediously go one by one and turn those properties on or off. Much like you could do it with changing their color, changing their size, anything like that. So the aggregate adapter generalizes that for DPE-based tools in general. So if you're making a DPE-based outliner or inspector or CVAR editor or whatever you think of doing, this allows a generic multi-editing. So you don't have to reinvent that wheel. And as for the future of the DPE, so we already have replaced old complex tools with new simpler ones, with sorting, filtering, and multi-editing coming in basically for free because those tools are already written for you. So right now we have that in the console variable editor, we have it in the inspector, and then we have an experimental asset editor that you'll see at the bottom there. That's a DPE-based asset editor that you can turn on in the console variables. It's experimental, so I don't recommend doing that yet, but we hope to replace more tools in the future with DPE-based ones because they should be simpler, easier to read and write, and any bugs that are found in one are probably common to the others. So we can just be fixing up the DPE and the common adapters, and that any of those fixes or optimizations will go to every DPE-based tool instead of having to rewrite and comb through common code between them. So as kind of project that I did over a week, I did an outliner replacement proof of concept tool, and although it wasn't as full featured as the existing outliner, it only took me a week, and I did all the basic functionality, sorting, filtering, turning on and off, allowing to change the visibility of items, things like that. So the main purpose of the outliner were done, and even though that's a very complex existing code base, replacing it with the common functionality provided by the DPE only took us a week. And one more kind of future stretch goal that we'd like to see in the long term for O3DE is having a concept of the data visualization on a particular platform where the view can be rewritten for that platform, but the document doesn't have to be. So say, for example, you wanted to have a game and you want to be able to inspect the entities at runtime, but you're on a Nintendo Switch or something like that, or one of the platforms we directly support. Then if someone writes a DPE view for that particular platform, then the document itself is already exists and can be used directly. So we can suddenly have this concept of maybe games can inspect properties and debug themselves using O3DE dynamically without having to rewrite everything every time. So the DPE could exist in a host machine, and then on the platform, you could have the visualizer for that. Anyway, the sky's the limit, and that's the dream. But regardless, the separation of view from document is really a helpful concept and widely used in modern tools today, and it's been a great boon to O3DE in general. And that's it for the DPE. Any questions for me?
How feasible would extra visualization, so let's say like histograms, graphs, how flexible like are the visualization tools that are available to us with the DPE?
That's an interesting question. That would be more bespoke. Right now the DPE is really more of a kind of column, like a row column hierarchy. So it's a hierarchical document, much like an HTML or something like that. So we could make interesting inlets into that so that we could have visualization for particular sub document types. But currently it's really about grid-based layouts, but with including subgrids and hierarchical data. So it would take some work, but it is possible. It's just not what the DPE is currently designed to do, because the DPE is really designed to replace the RPE and mimic its functionality while adding new features.
Gotcha. Fair enough. Yeah, I was thinking more, Joe mentioned for profiling, but our animation tools, we have a lot of timelines and keyframing and even the machine learning gem that I put in recently where you just want to like graph out your costs, your training costs. So those sort of visualizations, if they were available with DPE, then we could actually move all of those tools over to DPE as well.
Not yet, but that sounds super intriguing and possible future frontier for the DPE.
Okay, good to know. Oh, thank you. Awesome presentation.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else have any other DPE questions?
About interaction with the existing gem system, does this open up the door anymore to having folks like contributors just randomly create third-party tools that then people could, integrate themselves into their own environment to create like a custom kind of O3D editor experience that's very specific to like the different toolings that they've integrated? Or does that not impact that?
Yeah, it should make any kind of soup to nuts editor, graphical, especially hierarchical editor like this, much simpler to design. There's a lot of overhead in understanding how Qt or Qt works and their kind of Qsort filter proxy mechanism and stuff like that. So it should allow for anyone who wants to create a custom tool for DPE, and including new gems to use to generate a document that without them having to touch the view. So they can just generate the document and say, yep, these are the widgets, this is the layout, this is how this works, here's some custom properties if you want to do it that way. And the DPE should, with very little finagling, depending on what custom view attributes you want to put in there, should just render it as is. So it should be a lot faster to make new tools this way, including in gems.